Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you look at where we are, kind of how we get here. You have this bullish return from COVID, kind of the return to happiness that people say. You know, the markets are dollars are flooding back into the marketplace. Many brands who had a bit of a shutdown period are going back into recovery mode. Sales are surging. A lot of people had the best fourth quarter 2020 ever, and they're having a bullish first and second quarter as well. So when you start to look at all this, it's the thing that has to be considered is a bit of the PTSD from brands when you look at the things and contracts they were locked into in 2020 that they almost couldn't get out of, and now had to start thinking about a new level of nimbleness, flexibility, adaptability in the marketplace, that anything can happen and the world goes to a ground stop, and so do our dollars. So when you start to think of the context of Newfronts, Upfronts, and the surge around all things streaming, the first thing is that brands are looking at, okay, we have to be more prudent about not locking away our dollars for a year just because the changing tide of what can happen. So you start to see a shift from annual planning to quarterly planning. You start to see that certain things we locked up in long-term agreements, but certain facets of the buying literally go to quarterly or have to be done on a case-by-case basis. So there is some apprehension and just an understanding in how you essentially could have dollars tied to but can't activate around them because of circumstances beyond the reality. When you start to look at, some of the things that Nina talked about, the convergent paths of Newfronts and Upfronts, she's absolutely right. At the end of the day, a consumer just sees content that they binge watch, and even beyond the world of the Upfront and Newfronts, you start thinking about TikTok, a lot of the social video surge, YouTube surge. Look, at the end of the day, they're just curating what it is they like in terms of understanding. A lot of the things, when we look from a planning perspective, really has to be oriented back in terms of the consumer's view. We have to literally start looking at what they do. Essentially, why are they consuming what they consume? How do they make decisions around a given category? What is their path to purchase? What media types really informs that, really moves that? So the planning across the spectrum of all things Upfronts, Newfronts, and even the ancillary additional, video content or types of buying that you're buying, all track to that. And that's what we're really seeing. While there is such a surge in data, with now the amount of options, there has to be diligence on how the data is used. What type of data signals are essentially turned on? How are we sitting there layering it up in campaigns to really be taught and understand the consumer movements? So we're not buying our favorite networks just because we like the programming. We're buying in and around this programming because those programs have the context or subject matter relevant to actually move a consumer down a purchase path to take an action for a given brand. So you're going to see a lot more intelligence in the intentional nature in which planning is now going to be done. It's not going to be, hey, here's our upfront conversation is over here. Let's look at our digital options, go to the Newfronts. It's going to be a much holistic view, hopefully sitting the consumer back in the middle and essentially making the decision, okay, what now matters in terms of how we move a consumer from consideration to purchase to loyalty. Let's think about the entire funnel, top of, middle, lower, understanding what only sits at the top of the funnel, and perhaps that's in your upfront buys. What is mid-funnel lower? Perhaps that's in your Newfront buys. And then what are mechanisms that can actually pull a consumer all the way through the entire funnel, even if it's from the initial ad exposure? I think you're also going to see just a level of getting much savvier at the category level, because you can't just assume a set buy structure works for all products and all categories and all disciplines. So you're going to see a greater intelligence of people starting to understand, okay, from an automotive perspective, what's going to matter in terms of how we move mind share? From a beauty perspective, what does that conversation start to look like? When some of the things that Nina talked about, the onset of commerce, I mean, that changes everything. Now that you can move commerce into a TV-like environment, that changes everything. Now you're seeing major networks bring commerce as a massive data signal. Because look, at the end of the day, a customer, a client is essentially looking for a buyer. They're not necessarily looking for the audience. And most brands aren't in the business of creating TV shows. They create a product for which they're looking for an end consumer. So they're now starting to understand what signals can we attach to our overall buying strategy to far better understand, is our buyer there essentially? So I think the biggest problem when people looked at, streaming and connected TV, OTT, VOD, FEP, they applied the same formula like it was linear in just a digital equivalent or a digital experience. But that almost negated the value proposition of what digital platforms give, not only to support and accentuate linear, but things that it can accomplish that linear has yet to catch up with. So I think when you start to really break down the differences between all the buying options now, you're going to see a lot more forthright in terms of really people understanding what each mechanism should serve in the context of the ecosystem of all things buying. And again, putting the consumer squarely in the center of that conversation, looking and understand the consumer journey. So you're going to see hear a lot more conversations about getting intensive into consumer journey mapping, and then understanding to what degree that consumer profile consumes content and where, so that the buy structure matches where the time spent is. I kind of refer to this notion as the attention stack. Yes, there's been a huge surge in programming across the range, and we all saw this through COVID. So whether it was binge watching, so it was really from an OTT perspective, it was really around, you know, your social platforms, YouTube, your TikToks, your Snapchats, even Instagram, Facebook network, where there was about more binge watching around network TV shows. But it's where they're putting the time and attention in that matters most about your ability to essentially move mind share. So I think you're going to see a lot more discussions around really breaking down the behaviors behind the programming, behind the network, behind the tentpole. Doesn't matter if we're talking soccer, FIFA, we're talking essentially World Cup, we're talking US Open. You know, I mean, again, the idea is really get into a consumer understanding of how they identify with that content matter. Does it make sense for your brand there? Do we need to lock that up in a longer term agreement, because that has a strong semblance to your brand's identity and the equity is built? Is the large part of your consumer buying audience there versus essentially feeling you need to be in that sandbox just because you have ultimately the affinity for that? So I think it's an exciting time. And I mean, it's never been more burgeoning. The conversation's never been more dynamic. There've never been more options. I think when you start to getting to the addressability of the environment, starting to look at to what degree that really can effectively be accomplished for your audience versus not, I think is the attribution conversation works into the discussion. To what degree you can tie on a content plus commerce formula, to what degree you can layer on data signals in terms of store visitor behavior to understand, okay, what types of media are we buying, purchasing, that actually we can get foot traffic tied to that to understand, are we moving them to a point of retail? We are now going to see the more intently mapping of two journeys between looking at the physical journey to retail, point of purchase to buy, as well as the journey being mapped that is going to be a digital journey. And we're starting to see more and more of the contactless buying phenom sort of merge. Most people, brands started to orient around this notion of direct to consumer through 2020. You saw, you know, Shopify surge through the roof and everyone needed to bolt on a Shopify account. So you start to understand how brands understand the power of a direct relationship. And I think what you're going to also see is an information sharing. Let's take what we know from direct engagement, direct transaction, and apply that learning to things that may be more at the upper funnel, but now can be informed. So I think what we hope to see is that with Newfronts, Upfronts converging, information sharing of what's happening across one platform, not assuming it's in a silo, but understanding, almost being insights agnostic and moving the information around from platform to platform to help inform buy decisions, because you never know what aspect of little data now helps essentially transform what aspect of what seemed to be more broader based targeting, but now can be essentially optimized, rethought in a way that's never essentially been accomplished before. So again, I think it's going to be exceedingly exciting times in terms of what we're going to see from the buy side when you start to look at what the trajectory is to close out the back half of 2021, go into 2022. I think you're going to start to see unconventional conversations be sort of tethered together, in which you may have, let's call it a connected TV partner that now has greater sight of what you're doing on the upfront with your linear partner, to understand, look, is there some blocking and tackling? Is there a way it can accentuate? Is there a way it will supplement? I think what you're also seeing is a divergent paths of brands saying, you know what, we were considering linear as a route, but based upon the performance we were forced into during the COVID outbreak, we're now going to focus on what is largely going to be a streaming sort of path to purchase, with connected TV being sort of our lead horse. So look, there's almost a schizophrenic nature in the marketplace in which there's so many different schools of thoughts. But again, I think when you start to look at what's emerged, what's transpired, it probably isn't a better time for brands to experiment. But I think the greater thing is looking at how the different media types can inform and not only teach the other media types that brands have, let's say, rested on or resided on or been beholden to, or just relied on in terms of building the brand equity. It's kind of like the window dressing was lifted during COVID. People got to really peek under the hood, really understand, and while intensive nature of having to understand what's going to work best for them. Brands during that era had to work with less, meaning less dollars in the marketplace to still prove out the margins. So essentially, they got a lot about smarter in terms of what might be the effect of media waste that had been essentially taking place in their advertising marketing campaigns over the previous years. But I think with everyone understanding the expectation, the bar has been raised as we push through the recovery into 2021 and set the new trajectory for 2022. It's just simply going to be a new era in terms of what the buying possibilities are going to be and the level of diligence that's now going to be employed as it pertains to moving into the marketplace and now understanding how the broader ecosystem of all the media options will now essentially sort of work together. So, in my sort of closing, wish everyone the best in terms of what the opportunity lies ahead for 2021. I said it's going to be an exciting year. I think as the marketers regain and sit themselves down in the catbird seat, I would employ them to explore the diligence of what is out there and look for the little information. Remember, media has to do more than just deliver impressions. At each point, it should be teaching you about your consumers. And I think that was a notion that was lost, in particular with certain media types, where there was a lot of media being bought, but it didn't teach the brand anything about the consumer and their consumer mindset. So at this point, I will hand it back